So, by saying ladies first, as the only lady in the panel, actually, I would like to set the scene the first. So, Lee, you have very detailed experiences in all around the world, and you are working with cutting-edge technologies in the clean energy. So, your hands are really in the kitchen, and you are working on it. So, throughout your career, what are the 3 most challenging issues to decarbonize the global economies? What would you say?
Yeah, thank you so much. And let me start actually by thanking the Atlantic Council and EBRD, of course, for having us, for convening us for this really important conversation today. And yeah, I want to introduce quickly the Clean Air Task Force because we're a little bit of a non-traditional climate organization. We were started 25 years ago in the United States focusing on reducing emissions from power plants, but have since expanded to be active globally and really focusing on overlooked solutions, climate solutions, many of which have been discussed here. This includes nuclear, carbon capture, hydrogen, methane, also transmission infrastructure. And we're really excited to see what's happening in some places of the world on some of these technologies. But I think going forward, it's really, really important to remember that we need to first, of course, reduce the time it takes to scale these technologies, but also create enabling conditions in globally. So, okay, you asked me about 3 pieces that I would say are the most important observations on the energy transition. I think the first one is that decarbonization is really about systems transformation. Our primary energy demand is satisfied by fuels and electricity. And to really decarbonize, and keeping in mind that 95% of the emissions budget that's left to the Paris Agreement is already locked into existing and planned infrastructure, we really need to rethink how we're going to rewire our electricity system and also reimagine global fuels markets. And I think that systems transformation has not happened. Actually, when we're looking at Europe right now, with 50 billion euros in unabated fossil fuel infrastructure investments, we're seeing we have not transformed the energy system. And the second piece, I think what's really, really important is this recognition that each country or region will have a different suite of technologies for decarbonization, as well as a different speed of decarbonization. That's why we need to bring to scale all clean energy technologies, but also, you know, in the US and Europe, where I've been working a lot, we need to remember that a clean Europe, a clean US is not the end game, it's the beginning. I actually was just at a ministerial in Cape Town, and there the discussion is really focused on energy access and energy infrastructure as the first line of defense against the impacts of climate change, but also as a foundation for climate action. And then I think the final piece is climate is a hard infrastructure problem, right? I think we've heard it, 3 gigawatts of wind, 5 gigawatts of solar a year here in Turkey, 30 gigawatts of nuclear to 2050, 5 to 8 million tons of hydrogen production. This requires a lot of infrastructure. And so we need governments to really think about, plan, what is the kind of infrastructure we need to decarbonize, how we're going to mobilize investment, which is what we're going to discuss today, but also what's the workforce we need to actually deliver on this infrastructure, on these technologies. So I think this is kind of where we're focusing our work on, where we're looking to partner with government, with companies to really find solutions that work for decarbonization.
Okay, so I perfectly understood that the infrastructure is the key for the decarbonizing the economies. But when we are talking about the infrastructure, of course, the companies are directly going to lenders in order to get the money and realize their projects, because whether it's a solar power plant or a hydrogen plant, these are costly projects, and not any company cannot actually cover all this investments from their own resources. So this is bringing me to go to Gianpiero, because he has 25 years of experiences, and at the beginning, as I said, that if someone needs money, they can go to Gianpiero. So Gianpiero, infrastructure is there. This is the key issue for the decarbonization. But I want to understand the priorities of EBRD in financing the projects. Which projects are your priority areas right now?
Thank you very much, Ezer, for the question, and thank you for having me in this panel. I would say the first priority of the EBRD is really to serve our clients and our countries of operation in progressing, advancing in the process of decarbonization, taking into account, of course, priority of energy security, food security, which is a big topic these days, but also, of course, economic and social development. So I think that's our priority. So in this context, we look at ways to support the role of the private sector in identifying actually the right solutions in a context that delivers these sort of objectives. Clearly, we need to take into account the specific country context, the specific market context, the sectoral context, so this is important in defining priorities and objectives. I would say that there are some areas which are relevant and important across all the EBRD regions, supporting at scale renewable energy, supporting the grid and the infrastructure that enable more renewable energy to come into stream. And certainly there are, specializations or say area specialization that certain countries have. If I look at North Africa, where we operate, in Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, certainly apart from the renewable energy potential, there is certainly a very interesting potential for low-cost renewable hydrogen. So that's an area that we're looking at. We're supporting countries in this respect. If I look at Turkey, since we apart from renewable energy efficiency remains an important topic in the country. Circular economy, as we discussed in the panel this morning. But also, we need to look at the developing the supply chains of technology and services. In the case, again, of Turkey, we talked about the previous panels about the importance of heat pumps. So clearly, the country has the potential to be a major global player in this space. Maybe I'll close with giving you a sense of the way we look at the problem of decarbonization, because our role, we believe, as a financial institution, as a development institution, is really to work on the enablers. What are the building blocks that allow the private sector to shift finance, to shift investments towards low carbon technologies and activities. So in this respect, I think we operate in trying to create what, the famous enabling environment. And I think there are three conditions, or let's say three elements, three pillars of our action. One is on the policy side, so working with the government, with the sector, in defining long-term strategies that underpin the decarbonization. There is a significant role of the market in also developing market instruments. One example, we've been active in 16 countries in developing the market for sustainable energy, particularly renewable energy. So 16 countries we've been operating for the last 4 years, in fact. And this work, particularly around renewable energy auctions, has led to over 3 gigawatts of renewable energy investments taking place for over $4 billion of investment. And the third pillar is about the capacity building and the business models. One example, we have launched last year a quite significant program to support our clients in the corporate sector, in the financial sector, but also at the municipal level, introducing comprehensive climate corporate governance practices. So introducing climate considerations, green considerations in the investment decision process and in the way actually investments are prioritized.
That's good. That's good. So EBRD is exactly providing a substantial amount of financial resources to all around the world, actually in Turkey too. I think that in the years to come, of course, EBRD will continue to play another important role in the region. So, Evren, actually, you have developed substantial amounts of renewable energy projects. As I mentioned at the introduction, the solar, wind, these are your specialty areas. There's a burning fact. I would like to say that we are almost all countries are dependent on certain countries, especially China is one of the biggest exporters of the solar cells. And we know that the technology is also developing as well. And in the next years, we will be talking about new technologies in the solar industry. So which solar technologies will pioneer the growth of the solar power plants in the future in Turkey or in the world? What do you think?
First of all, I would like to thank you and Atlantic Council for having me here. So I think that's a very good question, because our company and myself, I'm in the energy business for more than, I think, 13, 14 years. So, and specifically, I worked in solar since 2007. So it has been 15 years in a specific industry, and I've been in module production factories, I've been in EPC companies, I've been in distribution companies, I've been in investment companies. So I've seen the major players in the industry. So you have rightfully pointed out that the technology is also, of course, getting, let's say, more complex. And when I started my career back in 2008, we had hard times even describing how the technology works to financiers. So not like banks like EBRD, of course, EBRD or the other IFIs were deep into the system, so they knew how the solar was functioning. But some private banks, they had their hesitation whether solar works. They were saying that this is quite expensive. The LCO is much higher than the grid. So, you know, things were not moving quite fast at that time, back in 2008, 9, 10. But now, I mean, if you install a small solar power plant and installation in your factory in Turkey, the payback period is not more than 4 years. So it's no-brainer to install solar in your rooftops for the moment. But there is something quite critical in the industry, as you have rightfully pointed out, that 90% of the solar modules that we are using globally is made in China. I think this is one of the biggest, or the biggest issue that we're going to have some discussions in the near future. Because, you know, I mean, in the other sectors, like if you're in geothermal, if you're in wind, if you're in hydros, I mean, the equipments that you can source is various, from Europe to the US, or from, let's say, Asia, even to Turkey. So we do have some local production there. But specifically in solar, more than 90% of the production is in China. China is dominating the market for the last 10 years, I should say. There used to be production in Germany, in Europe. There used to be production in the US. Still, there is some small production in the US left, but 90% is in China. And you might well know that, you know, US has a specific regulation that you need to, let's say, have specific permits to import Chinese modules to the country, due to the fact that US is claiming that China is using forced labor in Xinjiang region to produce the cells, the silicon cells, and then the modules there. And you need to present traceability documents that the modules is not produced with the cells coming from Xinjiang region. So I guess US is like setting the stage for the future, let's say, issues in the global world to source solar modules. I'm pretty sure that Europe is going to follow this sooner or later. So I do hear that there are some, let's say, discussions that started in the Europe as well, that like these modules, were they eligible to be imported to Europe. So I do see that there is going to be a transition from Chinese manufacturing to European, even to US manufacturing. We have partially some production in Turkey as well, but unfortunately we're buying the raw material from China still. So there needs to be some local production of wafers and cells in Turkey. So everything that has been even like developed in the new technologies, as you have said, unfortunately is coming from China, like organic PV or perovskite technologies. This is mainly coming from China. And I do see personally a big risk there. If something happens, like in the future, just like Russia and Ukraine tension, so there are embargoes or other, let's say, barriers to Russia. If same thing happens to China, let's say China has decided to invade Taiwan, and we have, let's say, sanctions to China, then whole solar industry has an issue.
So let's continue with you again, because you touched upon a very important issue on the supply chain problems or potential supply chain problems. After the COVID pandemic, we have encountered very serious supply chain problems, because in Turkey, I remember that some companies actually delayed their deliveries almost a year, 14 months, 15 months. This is substantial time in terms of realization of a project. The first, do you expect a supply chain problem? Because, you know, there's a geopolitical situation, especially in the Taiwan. This is my first question. The second, You mentioned that 90% of the solar cells and the technologies are coming from China. Actually, this is very risky. And what we know, especially after mid-2000s, because of the scale of economy, China could hurt European cell technology developers or Western cell technology developers. Can we find a solution for this? Because they have a huge scale of economy and they can invest a lot, they can subsidize the companies, whatever. So what Western companies should do to own their own technologies? So much pressure on you, I noticed, but actually these are important topics.
Exactly, these are quite important topics, and I think these would be the two major topics that we have to discuss in close future, because this is going to affect the industry a lot. So supply issues, yes, unfortunately I expect that supply issues is going to be problems again. I mean, we will be having supply issues in 2023 and onwards, unfortunately, because this zero COVID policy is hurting Chinese economy, Chinese manufacturing, and also supply. And if you're heavily dependent, like 90%, like solar, then if the factory stops due to pandemic or any issues, then we have issues, problems here. So we are acting as Turkey's biggest equipment distributor. Unfortunately, we had to delay some of our customers' projects because, you know, we got the order, we have given the order, we paid, but unfortunately equipments didn't ship out from China because the ports were closed. So there's nothing to do, and we have received a force majeure letter from the producers. You know, they are right. And it's legally, I mean, there's nothing that we can do. So this has a direct effect to the projects that are under development. So I unfortunately expect same thing is going to happen next year. Not only in solar panels, but inverters as well, due to chipset problems. The supply is going to be unfortunately disrupted. So same thing is going to happen. That's why we're trying to stock whatever we can this year in order to smoothen up the curve there. So the second question, besides, let's say, supply, I still see that European, let's say, companies, American companies, they should be developing their own technology. In fact, they had done it in the past. Germany was the pioneering country in the world that developed solar and even commercialized solar. You know, solar commercialized back in 2003 when Germany started their renewable energy law, which they say Erneuerbare Energiegesetz. So everything has started back in 2003. So, but these were coming with huge government subsidies. You know, the subsidies were around like 45, even 50 euro cents per kilowatt hour that is being transferred to the grid. So I'm not telling you that same subsidies should be in place to flourish the investment there, but this time maybe some subsidies needs to be for production of equipments in Europe and in the US. Because they have the technology, they have the know-how, but without a government support, you cannot give life to an industry that has already been dead. Unfortunately, I have to pronounce that the industry in Europe, production industry, is unfortunately dead for the last 10 years. So we need to have strong and heavy helps or subsidies coming from governments, not only in country level, maybe in European Union level, and in, let's say, in US, in the country level there as well. Like Europe has decided to invest in chipset production. So, you know, it has the same, unfortunately, risk, like 65% of the chips is being produced in Taiwan. Maybe that's one of the reasons why China is very, let's say, dominant on Taiwan, and they would like to, let's say, see that Taiwan has another kind of like ruler. It has exactly the same effects in solar equipments as well.
Okay, so this is crystal clear actually, and yeah, Go ahead, Gianpiero.
No, just a brief reflection, if I may, because I think I agree that concessional instruments, incentives are needed to help addressing the problem of the supply chains. At the same time, there are also other structural issues that need to be tackled, because incentives, subsidies are good only if actually address very specifically, policy or market barriers. And I'm referring here to the fact that, let's say, permitting process in many countries is still very slow and very uncertain. It's not only about the timing, it's the certainty of the process. Many countries are still reluctant to open up the market for private sector developers in renewable energy, and perhaps investments to, for example, strengthen the grid and allow more intermittent capacity to come on stream are often delayed or deprioritized. So I take your point, but I think the regulatory element needs also to be tackled, because otherwise you create dependency and expectation on the developers that then is not sustainable.
Yeah, that's clear. Do you want to add something, Lee?
Go ahead.
No, okay.
I have some thoughts, but I'll come in later.
Well, if you have some thoughts, let's go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think this is a really fascinating conversation, because it really, if we're thinking what the US has just done, or in Europe, it's really about creating industrial policy for the manufacturing of clean energy technologies, and that energy security is also security of supply of clean energy technologies. And so I just wanted to reflect on this, that, as we've just seen in the United States, the Industrial Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, it's really an investment in the manufacturing of clean energy technologies and manufacturing of other technologies with climate benefits. So I think for a long time, before kind of this geopolitical crisis this year, especially in the US and Europe, there was this idea that we're going to do climate because of climate. We're going to do behavioral changes. It's not necessarily a huge infrastructure problem, but now this realization has happened that we need to transform our economies, that we need security of supply of clean energy production, and that we also need to rethink what are our strategic priorities in terms of clean energy technologies. And so I think this is where actually advanced energy technologies like, for example, nuclear come back to the table, or even, as I said, $50 billion in unabated fossil fuel infrastructure. What's the opportunity to transform into hydrogen? What are the fuels of the future? We're seeing new fuels provider with ammonia in the Middle East. So I think this is a really, really important conversation that we're having. And then my final point is really on, of course, the permitting aspect, right? Again, it's an infrastructure problem. We need to speed up the energy transition, but we need to build a lot. And this is going to be really challenging going forward.
So actually, two topics are rising here. The first, infrastructure. The second is the technology development all around the world. And actually, this reminds me the storages, the batteries, actually, because like 15 years ago, 10 years ago, when we were discussing about the renewables, especially solar and the wind, we were particularly focusing on the baseload resources, which were then coal and gas or nuclear in certain countries. But specifically in Turkey, we were focusing on gas and coal. Actually, I do remember that the Energy Market Regulatory Authority or other kind of authorities, as well as transmission system operators, when they were permitting the licenses, they were focusing on the existence of the coal and natural gas power plants in the system in order to control the frequency of the grid. But right now, especially until very recently, and maybe it's going to be accurate to say that thanks to high energy prices, most of the companies are started to focus on batteries and battery technologies. But when we are analyzing the battery technologies, we easily forget the rare earth materials or earth minerals, which is lithium-ion, for example, in many countries all around the world right now. Then I want to ask to Özgür, because I know Özgür is particularly interested in batteries and storage technologies. Özgür, do you think that, I'm not going to specifically ask about the technology of the storage, but I'm curious about the supply of the rare earth materials. Do you think that shall we have any shortage of this kind of materials in the future? How do you see?
Yeah. First of all, thank you, Eser. I am happy to be here with you all, and thanks to Atlantic Council and EBRD to organize such a distinguished event. Regarding with the question, Eser, there is a good news. Yes, renewable energy is expanding and challenging baseload fossil fueled power plants to replace them, and paving the way the decarbonization goal. But this good news create a risk regarding with the items that you described. Supply chain system, mining is one of the key component of supply chain. If you want to feed those booming renewable energy in terms of storage, EV market, considering the regulations, restrictions to be applicable in Europe to forbidden diesel or gasoline-powered cars, so you will have more electrical vehicles in the street. So you have to meet such demand with the batteries, right? You can invest on the battery factories. It started with mega factories, then became giga factories. Now, by 2030, we will be using the words terawatt, right? It is estimated to have 7 terawatt-hour battery factories will be available in the world. So coming back to the supply chain subject, when you look at the battery cell, the 50 or 60% of the cost is coming from the active material, which are the cathode and anode material that are used in the battery cell manufacturing. Specifically, critical elements are lithium, cobalt, nickel, manganese, and graphite, of course. Again, this today, the approximately 600,000 ton per annum needed lithium, needed for the existing battery factories. But by 2030s, this amount will be increased to approximately 2 million tons per year. You have to provide 2 million tons lithium for those battery factories to feed electrical vehicles, electronics, or the energy storage purposes. Cobalt is also another rare earth element, and the majority of the reserves are in Democratic Republic of Congo, only one country. So lithium, for instance, the majority of the ore reserves are in South America, Bolivia, Chile, and some Australia. So they are not geographically uniformly distributed minerals all around the world. So it is quite possible, most likely, to have Chinese domination on silicon, Russian domination on natural gas. So maybe in the future we will be talking about the lithium domination or cobalt or graphite. Yes, mining is important. It should be supported in terms of regulation and financing to create enough raw materials for those upcoming trends that we will face.
Can I add one more question?
Sure.
Because, well, wherever we go, we see this geopolitical risk. When we go to natural gas, we see the geopolitical risk, especially after the war in Ukraine and Russia. When we go to oil, almost a substantial part of the oil is being produced in the geopolitically risky countries. When it comes to solar technology, China is dominant over there. When we are going to the mining industry, as you said, that some certain countries are dominant over there. So wherever we go in the energy industry, we see this political and geopolitical risk. This is the essence of the industry. But when it comes to the materials, I know that in the recent years there are some scientific research that about production of synthetic materials to fill the rare material. How do you see that? Can we use the synthetic materials?
Well, actually, Turkey is one of the good example for it, because Turkey managed to extract lithium from liquid disposal of boron. Etimaden in their facilities in Eskişehir, Kırka, they managed to produce lithium from boron disposals. I know that it is still in very elementary stage. They're still doing laboratory works, but seawater can be resources of lithium. With the electrolysis process, they can maybe produce lithium. So this type of artificial solutions, technology-based solutions should be sought definitely, because the fact is the natural resources are limited and not uniformly distributed all around the world. And considering the battery factories, battery suppliers are at this moment Far East countries like Japan, China, South Korea. Lately, European Union and United States and UK, they started their own programs to compete with those market. So limited number of battery supplier, limited mining facilities or reserves. So it is most likely to face with another geopolitical crisis in the near future. So artificial materials should be sought, SRB. For instance, in graphite, actually graphite is an interesting example, maybe a opposite way, because at this moment, natural graphite and artificial graphite, synthetic graphite market share, artificial graphite is a little bit higher than natural graphite. But the technologies currently, the way they produced graphite artificially, it is very energy intensive process and not very environment friendly process, unfortunately. So considering the higher energy prices, this option will be diminished in the future, maybe.
Okay, so
But
I think the same story here as well, because this technology should be developed, but investment amount is going to be substantial, and most probably you will say that this R&D processes should be somehow subsidized or supported by the governments. Is that right?
Definitely, SRB. For instance, Turkey has significant graphite resources in Kastamonu region, but unfortunately the type of the graphite is not suitable for battery grade. It's kind of amorphous. The carbon content is not very rich. I mean, the decarbonization is very important for the climate, but the graphite, the battery technology, carbonization is needed for the graphite to do its own functions in the battery cell. So maybe an innovative refining methodology or technology can be developed to use that kind of amorphous graphite reserves as well in the business.
This is I think the capricious part of the business. You know, when everybody is talking about electrical vehicle EVs, generally most of the scientists are rising about the mining industry and how mining industry is carbon intensive. So, you know, there is no one and very easy solution in the decarbonization process. Probably this is going to be an evolutionary perspective, and this is a living process, it's an evolution. Well, when I am working with the companies actually focusing on new technologies or R&D technologies, they are creating very nice business plans, but when they apply to lenders, especially with their business plans, well, not, I will not say mostly, all the time, they cannot get the financial support from the financial institutions. That's why, again, I want to come back to Gianpiero by keeping my promise. If you need money, go to Gianpiero. So Gianpiero, we need money. And we have a company. Let's assume that we are developing a technology or we have a good project. If I apply to EBRD, what would be the parameters that you assess my application? I know it's going to be different if it's a solar power plant, it's going to be different if it's the hydrogen. In the first round, you mentioned about some 3 pillars, but can you be more specific about your parameters of the assessment?
Sure. Maybe I can start with a bit the orientation of the EBRD, which is not very different from other multilateral development banks, right? Because ultimately, we've set for ourselves some targets, some ambition, and also some, how should I say, criteria, indeed. So when it comes to targets, the EBRD has, in fact, last year, we actually, at the end of 2020, we announced a green finance targets of 50% by 2025, which means we aspire to be a majority green bank by then. At the same time, also the aspiration to be by the end of this year fully Paris aligned. So what it means when we set targets, when an institution like the EBRD set targets like this, is not only to reflect an achievable ambition, but also to introduce a principle of orientation of where we would like our money to be allocated. And Paris alignment, what it means that basically all our projects are reviewed not only for consistency with the climate strategies and policy at the country level, but also to understand whether there are some underlying carbon, what we call carbon lock-in risks. In other words, we look at each project and each technology we finance, take into account whether or not these investments may prevent low carbon alternatives to emerge and be financed and be established. So this is a very important, as I said, orientation principle which determines a bit what we do in this space. I would say that also the way we are set up, we look at other dimensions, beyond, of course, the financial returns and the broader risk assessment. But clearly we tend to prioritize investments which result in additional benefits, either because we manage to bring in the private sector, the commercial financial sector, the so-called mobilization, or whether there are other co-benefits that emerge, either in terms of nature co-benefits or in terms that interventions and projects actually open up the market for private investors. So these are the kind of parameters within which we operate. At the same time, you talk about financing mechanisms. I would talk about financing approaches, in fact, because what we are trying to do is not only to develop and apply financial products that are specifically dedicated to support climate finance, green projects, but also to create the premises for these investments to take place. And I can give you one example. We've been doing a lot of work in a number of countries. Take Egypt, for example, developing a low carbon roadmap for the cement industry, which entails working with the government, working with the sector association, working with the cement companies in Egypt to determine jointly what are the steps that are needed to decarbonize the sector. It means identify the investments, the timing of these investments, and the conditions under which these investments need to take place. And in this process, not only we sort of support the whole definition of the scenarios, the modeling, the diagnostic, but there is also an engagement with the financial sector. There is an engagement with the project developers. And this basically gives some clear, well, I mean, that's the hope, some clear signals to the market and to the financial sector and to the investors about, as I said, the timing and the extent of the investments. So this is one example. At the same time, we're working a lot on trying to come up with new approaches in this kind of broader space of result finance, so trying to provide finance on the back of expected outcomes, expected results. One example is a program that utilizes funding from the Green Climate Fund and the CTF, whereabout this is particularly focused on the corporate sector, particular industry and companies operating in the agri-food value chains. Whereabout, we provide finance at commercial terms together with the Green Climate Fund or the CTF. So we start pari passu, so with the same terms, commercial terms, and then the concessional element, the money from the GCF, actually there are interest rate discounts on the back of certain milestones being achieved. And these milestones are associated to implementation of specific technologies, including innovative technologies, or at least innovative for the specific market, but also milestones linked to the improved, if you like, behavioral change associated to the understanding and the introduction of climate and green consideration in the business models of the companies we finance. So this is a combination of different elements. Again, our main objective is not only to provide finance, but actually to stimulate market reaction. Everything we do ultimately aims at introducing a price discovery element that gives, signal to the project developers, to the investors, and to the financiers.
Lee asked first.
Ladies first, yes.
Okay. Well, thank you. I think this is a really, really fascinating conversation, but I do want to come in here and bridge the conversation we had about R&D and next generation technologies and kind of bankable projects, investments, because I think there's a role for policy in between. So first of all, we want to have R&D. We want to incubate new technologies. For example, here in Turkey, Turkey has huge geothermal potential. Is there the next generation super hot rock geothermal potential, right? So there's investment from the government needed with R&D, but then policy comes in to enable actually infrastructure projects. You mentioned Erneuerbare Energiengesetz in Germany, which helped actually drive 90% of the cost reductions of solar in the early years by enabling learning by doing, building confidence in the technologies, right? And so I think this is really important because this is the bridge between the next generation technologies and what you're describing. And so from our perspective, I think as we're thinking about the whole suite of technologies, it's really about adaptive policy, changing policy every couple of years to respond to the market, respond to the financial sector as we're increasing the confidence in next generation clean energy technologies, but also reducing the risk by having different policies. For example, when we're talking about EVs, what about charging infrastructure? A lot of pieces have to fall into place. Permitting, you mentioned, is a huge risk to make these projects happen. And I think I just want to highlight that this is a continuous learning process, and we're not yet done on the financial or policy innovation side.
Yeah, Özgür, you had an intervention.
Yeah, actually, I agree the BAT's agreement as well, but regarding with the financing of this kind of projects, putting in the new technologies or new type of materials or processes, etc., incentive mechanisms also be there to support this kind of projects. Sometimes financial institutions can decide easily if they see such an incentive mechanisms are supporting those new technologies.
Well,
it is also
almost 100% guarantee. Because whenever you go to lender there, the first question, is there any government offtake guarantee, any incentive from governmental institutions? This is the first question. Mm-hmm. Whenever you go. Well, we have left 15 minutes. Lee, I was planning to ask you a question, but let's open the floor to the audience first. If there is any question, right now, we can take it. Yeah, I think Sardar Bey has a question.
Actually, Lee briefly mentioned about Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. Actually, this act brings extended the solar tax credit in the United States. So in the United States, if you are investing in the solar energy, if you are doing rooftop solar or grid-size solar, and in addition to that, they expanded the content. If you are producing photovoltaic PV panels in the United States, or wafers, or any kind of input which is required for the solar, you get 30% solar tax credit. It also includes contractor labor, on-site preparation, assembly, and original installation, and permitting fees, inspection costs, and developer fees. All equipment needed to get the solar system running including wiring, inverters, and mounting equipment, storage batteries. So all of that is included into this tax credit. So this is one of the ways of incentivizing this kind of investments. I don't know if you want to make any more comments, Lee.
Yeah, I'm happy to. We worked extensively on the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, which I think is really important to see together because the Inflation Reduction Act really provides incentives for technology deployment. So as you mentioned, solar, hydrogen production credit, carbon capture incentive credit. But then the Infrastructure and Jobs Act provides incentives for the infrastructure, connecting it all together so we can plan hydrogen hubs, CO2 transport and storage. And I think this is a really interesting way of designing climate policy, which is also, as I said, political economy outcome. And I think, you know, some of this policy we're also seeing on the European Union level, where we're having the Trans-European Energy infrastructure legislation being revised to include more technologies for projects of common interest, but also seeing the Innovation Fund really invest in kind of the next generation demonstration projects for innovation. So thank you so much for this comment.
Yeah. Any question? So, yes, Sadar, go ahead.
I just want to add that as the U.S. Department of Commerce, we encourage Turkish firms to come to the United States and invest in this sector, so that because the United States need a lot of investment for solar energy and other renewable energy sources. So you are all welcome, and we are here to help you.
Okay, so let's give another break and turn my second question to Lee. So this, actually, I have reserved this question for that moment. You know, I'm wondering your impartial opinion. This is a family gathering, so I'm really wondering your impartial opinion. Since you've worked a lot on carbon capture and carbon storage, I know that you have top level of expertise on this level. Well, there are various types of technologies or projects are being developed in the carbon capture side. So which are the most commercially viable ones?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. We talked about cement decarbonization. Carbon capture and storage is the only way to fully decarbonize cement, in addition to efficiency and clinker substitution. We talked about that we need a lot of steel to actually deliver the infrastructure projects for energy transition, again, an application where carbon capture can help make a difference. Hydrogen production, we're looking to kickstart the global hydrogen market. Blue hydrogen, carbon capture on steam methane reforming can help us produce hydrogen more cleanly, in addition with methane control. So I think the carbon capture came back on the map about half a decade ago when I started working on it, because industrial decarbonization was recognized that it had been a blind spot so far. And so since then, governments have been scrambling to really understand how to deploy and commercialize the technology. U.S. government has done more than any other government in the world to do so. We're seeing many, many more projects in Europe, but also in some other markets. Projects are being planned, China, the Middle East, India. And so we're really very excited to see that there's now a flurry of applications, a flurry of technology providers really entering the market. And I think this is now where this conversation actually ties together. To really commercialize carbon capture and storage, we need to enable learning by doing. So we actually have to deploy the technology enabled by government incentives. We have to build out the CO2 transport and storage infrastructure. Turkey, for example, I think has already some CO2 storage mapped and understanding. And we need to also make it investable. But for that, you of course need comprehensive climate policy, because it's essentially just an emissions control technology that only makes financial sense from this perspective. So I think the next frontier for carbon capture and storage is really thinking, how can we shorten the deployment timeline of this technology in next mover markets? And that means feasibility studies at industrial facilities. That also includes natural gas power plants, new LNG infrastructure. That means mapping CO2 transport and storage, sinks and sources, and really thinking about what does the future of this technology look like. So while there's more than 100 projects in planning right now, we still have a long way to go for commercialization.
Yeah. Well, I'm originally coming from oil and gas industry. For long years, actually, I represented oil and gas companies in Turkey and around the region. Some people knows it very well, actually. When in the industry, we were thinking about that depleted fields, especially depleted oil and gas fields, especially depleted gas fields could be the best reservoirs to make gas underground storages. But in the new trend, well, there is a big literature, but also I see that these depleted fields are being considered for the carbon storage fields as well. What do you think?
I mean, I think, you know, CO2 storage, there's different ways to store CO2. There's via utilization in products, but also CO2 storage underground. And I think this is a really important way for the industry of the future. How's the industry going to transform? And I think as a climate organization, our message to the industry is take the incentives that are available from governments right now in these first mover markets and show that you can transform, show that you can be part of the transition and deliver what I think is essentially a transformation of the global fuel markets, a reimagination of the global fuels markets. And I think that's what we're going to talk about in the next panel is hydrogen, zero carbon fuels, ammonia. So yeah, I think this is the future, is really how can we use this legacy infrastructure to enable the next generation of technologies. It's also being considered in the North Sea and other places. Yeah,
that's good. So last time I want to go to room. Is there any question? Apparently no. With the last question, I will close the panel. The last question will be about the electrification of the mobility. Not only the electric cars, the electrification of the mobility, because especially after the pandemic, we have seen a sharply increasing micromobility industry as well. We have seen e-scooters, e-bikes, and we started to see various types of e-vehicles for the logistics, transportation, and everything. But as Lee mentioned, that this is bringing us another challenging issue, is the charging. I know that Zorlu is one of the early investors in Turkey. Even we had no regulation and legislation about the e-charging industry. This is a general question for all the panelists. Please pick your own answers. How do you see the future of the e-mobility, and starting from charging, what are the challenges awaiting us in the future?
So if I may...
Yeah, please go ahead.
If I may start. Thank you. That was a good introduction to our company as well. Yes, before like the legislation is out, we spent our money and be the pioneer. So somebody needs to pay for it, and that was us. Now it's being paid back for sure. So we have around 1,500 sockets all around Turkey for EVs. But mobility, I should say, electrification of the mobility is not the future. It's today. It's being done today, as of today. So what is the biggest challenge? The biggest challenge is, again, I think, infrastructure. Because, you know, there are some locations that we think there needs to be chargers out there, but there we don't have any network. So you cannot bring electricity there. So it's too costly. Sometimes it is physically not possible to bring the network there. So then we need to rely on batteries. So if infrastructure is not there, there needs to be mobile systems that can power the charges. This is batteries. So batteries is quite important there. But of course, the batteries needs to be filled for sure. Then you need to have solar. So you need to solarize the batteries to electrify the battery and then to electrify the charger. So here everything is mobile. So we will be fully independent of the grid, probably in some locations that we strictly need chargers. So infrastructure is the biggest problem there, challenge. But we do have a solution there: batteries plus solarification.
Good. So Özgür?
Actually, Evren Bey summarized very well. I just can add on some perspective. Like, yes, e-mobility is going to be the part of our life, daily life, especially in the urban area, where the network and infrastructures, bringing those to that area is not easy. So storage plus solar panels can be a solution, but it is going to be very difficult. I mean, in the traffic, considering huge amount of EVs, same time many cars try to stop there. In a quicker time, they want to get their energy and keep going. So instantly, there will be huge amount of energy extraction from the system, right? You have to answer those demand. This is not going to be easy, sir, but we will be facing with it. It's kind of a Nobel Prize question, right? Who can solve it, get the prize.
Gianpiero, do you have any additional comments?
Yeah, very quickly. I'm not an expert in e-mobility necessarily, but I think it's important also to have clear in mind that there isn't probably a solution that fits every single case, because think about urban mobility versus regional mobility, or what I'm trying to say, in the case of the urban mobility policy and strategies, you may see emerging, car sharing businesses, which may entail a different take on infrastructure. And also, so it's quite a complex exercise to understand where to put the priorities. Also, let's not forget that we have forms of electrical mobility that's been around for decades. I'm thinking about trains, and I'm thinking about, so also they need to be supported and developed. So I guess I'm going towards the need of an integrated mobility plans that take into account all these elements and try to optimize the systems according to the local context. At the same time, we should not neglect, the other, transport system. Think about shipping, heavy-duty vehicles. It's unclear whether indeed, electrical solutions will provide, the type of services needed. So there is also an issue of, creating the infrastructure for low carbon fuels or zero carbon fuels to support these other sectors. So very complex.
Okay. So we open the panel with you, Lee, and close with you again. If you have final remarks about the mobility.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I agree with everything that has been said, but affordability of e-mobility is really, really important, because in the end, this is supposed to be a mass consumer market, and everyone should have accessibility to these technologies and to e-mobility options. So I think this is something where we would love to see governments work on and help really deploy these technologies or disperse e-mobility options across a wider population.
That's great. Well, Lee, gentlemen, thank you very much for being with me. I learned a lot, and I'm sure that this has been a very thoughtful panel for all the audience as well. And before closing our panel, I would like to remind that the next panel will be moderated by dear Bina Hussein. The title of the panel is Hydrogen's Role in the Clean Energy Transition. This is another very important topic that I didn't want to touch upon in this panel, so please keep your all interest to Bina's panel, and thank you very much for being with us again.